Welcome to our second uh, lecture or shared learning topic. Today, I want to go over uh, the sports industry and sort of talk to you about the wide variety of activities or sectors or areas that sort of encompass the full sports industry. There's a lot of slides here. I'm hoping to go through them relatively quickly so that we're not having to watch a really lengthy video. But I hope after this you'll get a really good sense of exactly what the sports industry is made up of. So one of the challenges around defining the sports industry is that it is so big and broad and so inclusive of a wide variety of different uh, segments that include things like sports tourism, sporting goods, sporting apparel, amateur sports and participation like minor sports, professional or quasi-professional sports, various types of recreation, high school and college or university athletics, outdoor sports like fishing and camping, sports businesses such as sports marketing firms or agencies, the sports sponsorship industry, sports media, sports governing bodies, and the list goes on and on. And so it really does include a wide variety of different kinds of sports businesses, all of which would engage in sports marketing in some capacity. So one of the challenges of defining the sports industry is that sort of the broadness and the ambiguity and, what we originally think of as being part of the sports industry. I suspect for many of you, you kind of narrowly, before the class started, you narrowly focused on things like professional sports. And that's certainly going to be a part of what we're talking about. But hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll see it's actually much, much bigger than that. So I don't pretend that this is an exhaustive list of categories within the sports industry, but this is one way of thinking about the various components of the sports industry. So you could talk about fan engagement, and we're going to go over these in more detail in a minute. We can talk about fan engagement, sports products, and sports participation. And we'll go into substantial detail in just a moment. So when we talk about sports, it's important to sort of frame, what we're talking about here. The reality is, different countries experience different priorities when it comes to sports. Different sports are popular in different countries. Certainly in Canada, we think of sports like hockey and basketball and football and baseball are sort of the major four professional sports categories. But we also have sports like, tennis and golf, and lacrosse is growing in popularity. But this differs significantly from other countries around the world that may prioritize things like rugby or cricket or soccer or whatever. And so there's really important regional differences. Some of those differences are based on climate. There's not a lot of downhill skiing in warmer climates, and hockey isn't as popular in significant parts of the world because it tends to be a cold weather sport. And so things like regional differences and climate differences, different cultural contexts can influence what is included in a particular area and what isn't with respect to sports. In some cultures, for example, gender may not be not that we have gender balance or equity even in North America, but certainly that polarization might be more pronounced in some areas of the world than others. Of course, many countries have deep histories with respect to certain sports and sport categories. So that could be an important factor to consider in terms of what do we include in this whole broad spectrum of the sports industry. When it comes to sports, we're talking about professional and amateur, organized and competitive sports, and just recreational sports as well. When it comes to products, we're going to talk more about sporting goods, fan merchandise, things like apparel, including athleisure clothing, and footwear, along with sports nutrition and supplements. And then, of course, there's just active participation, being active and, involved in recreational sports and fitness or outdoor activities. Those are some of the scope of what might be included and what we might want to think about when we're talking about the sports industry. So my students from sports marketing last year are the ones who organized and put this slideshow together, and they really found it fruitful and beneficial to organize the sports industry in these broad categories of fan engagement, sports products, and sports participation. And so we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about this in more detail. So when we talk about fan engagement, we're really focusing on the experience of sports. So things like sporting events where you actually attend a sporting function in person. So maybe you go and see, a game, for example. It also includes sports media. So watching sporting events remotely, whether they're live or recorded, is an experience type of engagement with sports. And then in the broader sense, sports entertainment, so things like sports betting and sports video games would fall under the fan engagement category, where the emphasis again is on the experience. You're not walking away with a product. If you're a consumer, you're having an experience of being in a stadium with, thousands and thousands of fans sharing in the viewing of a game, or you're in a sports bar and you're watching the Super Bowl with a bunch of people. That's part of the experience. Or again, video games, sports betting, which are incredibly popular, and we'll talk more about those areas in a minute, are very much about getting you engaged and involved in the sporting experience. So we want to think for a minute about sporting events and all the different kinds of business activities that are tied to sporting events. You've got things like ticket sales and parking fees and concessions sales at the venue where you're experiencing live sports. You've got things like media rights, which are huge. We're going to see in a minute sort of the magnitude of media rights and how much money is involved here. But this is the revenue obtained from sports media rights. So who gets to broadcast various sporting events? And there's competition among the various providers in terms of who gets to air these major sporting events like the Super Bowl or the Olympics. And it's competitive, and obtaining those rights can be a really lucrative contract for these media outlets. Things like sponsorship, so sponsorship of the venue, sponsorship of an event, or sponsorship of athletes in particular is an important part of sporting events and that sort of aspect of the business, as well as venue or event advertising. So if you go to any sort of professional or quasi-professional sporting arena or stadium, if you look around, you're going to see all kinds of advertising, some of it fairly technically advanced, and that's part of the whole sporting events experience. You've got merchandise, so sales of licensed products, whether it's jerseys or hats or other kind of souvenirs that are tied to the team or the league or particular athletes. That's part of the sporting events experience. And then even things like basic construction, the building of these, billion-dollar facilities and refurbishing those facilities. That's a major part of the sporting events sector within the sporting industry. So I'm not going to go over each of these. There's several of these little charts sort of throughout the slideshow, and you certainly can look at them at your leisure. But this gives you a bit of a breakdown between 2012 and 2019. So it's a little bit dated in terms of the U.S. Dollar value and the global dollar value of these various different sports events segments of the sports industry. So if you look just quickly at media rights, we're looking at a $32 billion revenue in globally in 2012. It's now up to um, 55.9 billion. Sorry, no, it's up to sort of 37 billion globally um, in 2019. So it's huge. And again, the U.S. being the lion's share uh, venue or I guess client when it comes to media rights. But these numbers are astronomical. 39 billion in sponsorship in 2012, now up to 55.8 billion in sponsorship globally in 2019. So we're talking about huge, huge, huge dollar values for these kinds of activities. This is very, very lucrative and very expensive. Media is huge when it comes to sports. We were looking at sports media ad revenue, so ad revenue generated by or spent, money spent by brands to make sure that their products are advertised during sports programs and aired during, you know, traditional broadcast television and cable news networks. So having your brand advertised through sports broadcasts, sports media subscriptions. So I know we subscribe to the CHL package where we get to watch CHL games. Um, and there's lots of subscription services out there. So cable, satellite TV, sports radio networks, as an example. Even sort of one-time like UFC fighting subscriptions where you pay per view for particular events. You've got digital sports advertising, so advertising revenues derived from ads on digital media platforms. Um, so, online outlets, which are really growing in popularity as vehicles for sports media rather than traditional television and print and radio. There's now digital outlets for sports media, and there's advertising opportunities there. It could be a banner, for example, on Sportsnet's webpage as an example of this kind of ad revenue, and then digital sports subscriptions. So subscribing to TSN's online sports coverage. All of these are examples of sports media activities that would sort of fall under the broad umbrella of sports marketing. This chart, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but you can see sort of the evolution. Back in the 1800s until the early 1900s, it was newspapers was the vehicle for sports media, and then it shifted to radio, sports magazines, and then television. Then the rise of cable, satellite TV, and of course now the focal point or the primary emphasis in sports media is now on internet or digital-based platforms. That seems to be where a lot of things are going, and sports media is certainly no exception. Fans are engaging more and more through digital and internet or online platforms than they are other kinds of platforms now, and that's sort of the future, at least the near future of sports media is going to be in a digital context. This chart just again gives you a bit of a breakdown of revenue on different kinds of sports media, and again you can see we're talking in the billions of dollars. $71 billion in global revenue for sports media ad revenue, which is again a huge amount of money involved in sports media. Expanding the definition of sports entertainment, we're looking at sports betting. Legal betting is growing exponentially in popularity. There's all kinds of avenues for people now to place sports betting. It's incredibly prolific. There's all kinds of opportunities there and really, really growing. One of the fastest growing areas. We've got fantasy sports leagues where you bet on fantasy teams. And depending on how your team or player does will influence your points. And it's a fun way for fans to get to engage with whatever sports league it is that you're betting on or engaging with. It's a way for fans to have a more interactive experience and more engaged experience. You've got esports, which are competitively played video games, and there's lots of that, and that's growing in popularity and certainly grew quite a bit during the pandemic. Sports video games, so things like, you know, for PlayStation or Xbox, the NHL game or NBA game or uh, golf. These are all a part of the sports entertainment package. Movies and books and collectibles are part of sports entertainment. All of you are reading a sports marketing book or a book about sports that hopefully has some marketing in it, and so that's part of this whole genre of the sports industry as well. Then you've got places like sports bars, where it could be a local gathering place for sports fans to watch games. Often there's multiple TVs in Charlottetown. Places like Boston Pizza has the pub side of the restaurant where, all kinds of big screen TVs, and they play all kinds of sporting events that are going on live, and you can go and you can have a beer and some nachos and some wings and with your friends and watch sporting events. So that's all part of sports entertainment as well. Expanding the definition of sports entertainment, we're looking at sports betting. Legal betting is growing exponentially in popularity. There's all kinds of avenues for people now to place sports betting. It's incredibly prolific. There's all kinds of opportunities there and really, really growing. One of the fastest growing areas. You've got fantasy sports leagues where you bet on fantasy teams. And depending on how your team or player does will influence your points. And it's a fun way for fans to get to engage with whatever sports league it is that you're betting on or engaging with. It's a way for fans to have a more interactive experience and more engaged experience. You've got esports, which are competitively played video games, and there's lots of that, and that's growing in popularity and certainly grew quite a bit during the pandemic. Sports video games, so things like, for PlayStation or Xbox, the NHL game or NBA game or uh, golf. These are all a part of the sports entertainment package. Movies and books and collectibles are part of sports entertainment. All of you are reading a sports marketing book or a book about sports that hopefully has some marketing in it, and so that's part of this whole genre of the sports industry as well. Then you've got places like sports bars where it could be a local gathering place for sports fans to watch games. Often there's multiple TVs in Charlottetown. Places like Boston Pizza has the pub side of the restaurant where, all kinds of big screen TVs, and they play all kinds of sporting events that are going on live, and you can go and you can have a beer and some nachos and some wings and with your friends and watch sporting events. So that's all part of sports entertainment as well. You can see that the the financial revenue breakdown for these areas of sports entertainment, including $216 billion in sports betting, which is obviously huge. Fantasy sports growing significantly, really popular in the U.S. Uh, Esports, not long of enough history to have numbers for 2012, but certainly we can expect that those numbers are going to continue to grow. Video games, again, a huge, $11 billion global sector. Sports bars, $44 billion worth of global revenue. So really, really important part of the sports entertainment segment. So let's move on to sports products. So before we were talking about experiencing products through the sports industry. Now we're going to be talking about products that we use. So sportswear, things like footwear, apparel, wearables for athletes and everyday people. So wearable technology, it includes gear and equipment for all different kinds of sports and recreational activities, and it includes sports health as well, whether it's sports medicine, nutrition, sports drinks, therapeutic products and services would all sort of fall under this particular category. Starting with sportswear, I mean, obviously many of us think of, first thing we think of is footwear or Nike sneakers, for example, but it could include all kinds of footwear for competitive and active sports, as well as casual wear. I mean, sneakers are no longer just for what being worn when you're, engaging in a physical activity or exercise. It's athleisure, right? We wear these kinds of things all the time. Sports apparel, so all the clothing, again, sometimes it's performance based. We wear these when we're participating in a sporting activity, but also we're increasingly wearing these kinds of garments outside of physical activity, sort of as a regular part of our clothing. And then you have sports wearables, so smart devices that are incorporated into our clothing or worn for health and fitness purposes. So things like Fitbits or smartwatches, apps on our phone that help us, track our physical activity or track our performance are all examples that would fall into this broad category of sportswear. As you can see from this chart, sporting apparel is huge. It's $204 billion industry with market leaders such as Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, even Lululemon being major players in this particular segment of the sports industry. And then you have gear and equipment, so recreational sports. So balls and bats and sticks and gloves and all the equipment that we use to play sports. You've got gym and exercise equipment, weights, treadmills, equipment found in gyms and fitness centers, elliptical machines, all those sorts of things. You've got outdoor recreation, so camping gear and hiking gear, fishing gear, hunting gear, and all of those sorts of affiliated products are part of the gear and equipment segment. And then you could even include recreational vehicles, so motorized vehicles like snowmobiles and jet skis and golf carts and recreational vehicles all fall under this category as well. You can see from this chart, outdoor recreation is a significant portion of the gear and equipment segment, and at about $231 billion globally in 2019, and that number actually grew substantially during the COVID-19 pandemic. People were, couldn't travel, were looking for ways to be active and healthy and to get outside, and so this is one sector that really experienced a positive outcome as a result of the pandemic. This area is one that's it was growing before the pandemic, but it certainly grew more than expected as a result of the pandemic. So sports health, things like sports medicine, whether it's, physiotherapist or occupational therapist, prosthetics, orthotics, treatment of injuries, injury prevention, and all the stuff that goes along with sports medicine, kinesiology, those sorts of things. Sports drinks like your Gatorade and Powerades and BioSteel and all those beverages or supplements or whatever that are used to provide energy or hydration or whatever to athletes before, during, and after training or during competition. You've got sports nutrition like vitamins and minerals and supplements to enhance overall health and performance. That could be protein powder or any of those other kinds of products that would fall under sports health. This segment right now is smaller, certainly than some of the segments we've looked at so far, but it's definitely growing in importance. Sports drinks alone are a $28 billion industry. So again, your Powerades, your Gatorades, and growing in importance. We talked about experiencing, we talked about using, and now we're going to talk about doing. So participation in sports. It could be a sports recreation, so sports that are played just for enjoyment. There can be some competitive aspect of it, both organized and unorganized, but it's non-professional sports. It's just people out there playing their sport because they enjoy it. It includes things like fitness and exercise, the fitness clubs, gyms, yoga studios, or all the at-home stuff like Peloton and all those subscription services uh, that are increasingly an important part of this particular segment. And then again, your outdoor recreation. So all the stuff that goes along with that is included in the doing. So it could be things like uh, camping equipment, or it could be, booking camping sites. It could be, fishing, going on a trip somewhere to go fishing or hunting. Those sorts of things would all be included in the doing part of it. So sports recreation, so all the outdoor sports like golf, skiing, tennis, swimming, soccer, baseball, softball, and other outdoor sports. It includes indoor sports like basketball, table tennis, volleyball, swimming. It even includes things like billiards, darts, and badminton. It includes youth sports as well as senior sports and all the leagues that go along with that. All this would be part of sports recreation. So sports that are for the fun of it, not necessarily, there can be some growth and development in terms of skill sets, but it's really about having fun and being active. So under fitness and exercise, you've got the fitness clubs, more traditional health clubs, gyms. You've got exercise studios like yoga studios or Pilates studios or specialized fitness activities. I don't know if it's still open. We had a rowing studio in Charlottetown. There was like a spin studio as well. Specialized gyms, like I said, a spin gym or indoor or outdoor strength training, for example, exercise, self-defense, those kinds of activities would all fall under fitness and exercise. And it should be no surprise to anyone that fitness and health clubs are a huge business. $98 billion business. But what we're seeing growing, and it's not reflected here because it's comparatively new, would be the subscription services like the Peloton and other subscription services would not be necessarily captured here, but the at-home subscription stuff is really growing in importance, especially during the pandemic. But it was growing in popularity beforehand, and it will continue to grow in popularity after the pandemic is over. So again, outdoor activities. This includes camping and hunting and fishing and all the stuff you need to do those sorts of activities, water sports like kayaking, canoeing, rafting, sailing, and including motorized boating and other water sports, even horseback riding, equestrian sports and ownerships, and having a horse and having stable fees and training expenses or horse care are all part of outdoor recreational segments. So this slide gives you a bit of a breakdown in terms of the overall size of the three categories that we were talking about: sports participation, fan engagement, and sports products, with products leading the way, followed by sports participation and fan engagement, but all huge, almost $2.2 trillion US, or 3.7% of the overall global economy. It's tied into all these various components of the sports industry. So this is an extremely important um, and far-reaching industry that touches all kinds of aspects of the business community here and around the world. So we're going to take a minute and just talk about, how the sports industry is influenced, or what is influencing the sports industry. We'll do a bit of an analysis of the macro environment. We'll talk briefly about coronavirus and what impact that has had. In some cases, it's been really positive. In other cases, it's been really quite detrimental. And we'll talk about things that are motivating or driving this particular industry. So at the macro level, this is a basic pestle analysis for those of you who are familiar with that concept. We're looking at the political environment. And so obviously there's different regulations in each country that will determine sort of what kinds of activities are permitted, especially around things like uh, sports medicine, sports therapeutic products that can be quite heavily regulated. We'll talk about coronavirus in a minute. We'll also talk later in the semester about political movements, things like Black Lives Matter, the Pride movement. We don't necessarily always think of that as political in terms of political parties or governance, but they are absolutely political movements and very much are shaping uh, the sports industry. You've got social factors like cultural differences, and in countries like Canada that are very culturally diverse, that has a really interesting dynamic on the different sports that people are exposed to or interested in. And there's a lot of newcomers to Canada are, I think excited to experience sports that have long roots in Canada, but also they're excited to bring sports from their own cultural backgrounds into Canada and grow those activities as well. A couple of years ago, we did an exchange program in the business faculty we had about 25 students from India join us in PEI for a 2 or 3 week sort of certificate program. And I was on the committee for this, and one of the things we did, I partnered with Andrews Hockey School, and we found a whole bunch of pairs of skates and helmets, and we took these students who were from India skating, and none of them had ever been on ice before skating, and they thought it was super neat. We had people that I knew who played hockey out there with them, showing them how to skate and towing them around. And it was a really interesting cultural experience because they had never really experienced hockey before. India is not known as a, big fan base for hockey, but these cultural exchanges provide those opportunities to cross-pollinate, exposure to pro sports, this whole idea of urbanization. So most major professional sporting teams are located in major cities, with more sort of quasi or semi-professional sports located in smaller cities. And so what impact does that have? And the overall urbanization of society in general is part of this. Gender norms, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the latter half of the semester, but what role do gender norms have? We're seeing a real push towards greater gender equality when it comes to sports, but we certainly have a long, long way to go. From a legal perspective, you have antitrust laws. So, if a media outlet has broadcasting rights, and you watch through a pirated or an unsubscribed outlet, there's issues there. Things like salary caps for some professional sports leagues, television rights are all sort of fall under the legal parameter. There's economics issues, things like government support and tax allocation. So there's a lot of government money that is invested in sports facilities and supporting sport programs from the minor levels all the way up to the professional levels. Government, you don't build a brand new stadium, for example, in Seattle for the Seattle Kraken, which is an NHL team, without significant government support and tax incentives. So things like the overall prosperity and buying power of the region. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the semester about purchasing power and the pricing strategy used by sports, because in some cases, sports are being priced too high, that they're becoming inaccessible to a lot of their fan base. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Technology, certainly social media, but also digital sports, and also technology that's embedded in the products that you can buy now, whether it's at home massage guns, or again sort of the Fitbit type devices that will track your heart rate and your exertion levels and your sleep patterns, and all those sorts of things are really important. And the technology is really advancing quite elaborately. And from the environment perspective, you've got sort of climatic differences and regional limitations. So what can people sustain, or what can regions sustain in terms of sports activity based on a whole number of factors? And we're going to talk more about these over the course of the semester. So this is a fairly timely topic, coronavirus and sports, the negatives. Certainly there was a lot of lost money there's an estimate that in the second quartile of 2020, collegiate and professional sports lost an estimated $5.1 billion in terms of gate revenue, merchandising, food and beverage sales, because obviously there was no live sports happening. Everything was shut down during the early part of the pandemic. And even as the pandemic progressed, people were, these venues were opening sporadically or with partial capacity. And I know in the States, many places are back to full capacity. It's not because the coronavirus is over there. It's because the governments there have just decided that they're okay with a certain level of death and disability resulting from the coronavirus. So it's not that they've cured or stopped the coronavirus, is that they've decided to accept the ramifications of what the coronavirus is doing to the general population, and have basically put living normally above the health and welfare of the citizenry, which, we can debate at length. There's obviously less disposable income. People's incomes, certainly in certain segments, was dramatically impacted as a result of the coronavirus. People lost their jobs or were laid off or had their hours reduced or whatever, which of course impacts people's disposable income. And because sports in the sports industry, a lot of it's not necessary, it's discretionary spending. And so, that was really impacted quite significantly. The potential threat to athlete development, and there's really unknown long-term consequences there. There's people who lost a whole year of playing time in highly competitive sports. So what impact is that going to have on their overall development? The tourism industry has been decimated as a result of COVID-19, and it's just really now starting to recover in some parts of the world, and with a long way to go. Sports retail across the world has been halted in terms of both the production of sporting goods, disruption in, factories and manufacturing plants had to shut down. The supply chain, in terms of logistics, getting product from factory floor to retail floors, has been dramatically impacted by COVID-19. And so, all of this is directly tied to COVID and some of the negative ramifications of COVID. But believe it or not, there's actually some positives with respect to coronavirus and sports. Some emerging markets of recreational sports actually saw an enormous boom as a result of the pandemic, especially around, as I was mentioning earlier, outdoor recreation like hunting and fishing and camping. Revenue in those sectors actually grew way faster than expected, as people were looking for alternatives. They couldn't travel, they couldn't, go very far, and so they decided to staycation and go camping and that sort of thing. Lockdowns and quarantines allowed for growth and innovation in esports and sports media. So sports apps were being downloaded at a record pace. People were engaging and playing more video games than they were previously. So those sectors did quite well. There's an increased importance on more localized tourism, so shifting buyer behavior from spending on hotels and airlines, and again, sort of staying closer to home, maybe buying an RV or renting an RV and going camping, or supporting local tourism experiences rather than going further afield. And then health and wellness, of course, with the COVID-19 virus, has taken a forefront because consumers are just in general more concerned about their health and wellness. And so sectors like fitness and exercise equipment expanded at 170% compared to pre-pandemic times. People were investing in equipment to work out at home, and making sure that they were getting physically fit because they knew that that would improve their health outcomes in general, but also particularly if they ended up getting the virus. So there were some positives when it comes to the sports industry with respect to COVID-19. So what is driving the sports industry? And again, it's sort of broken down into the three segments we've been talking about all along. When it comes to fan engagement, it's really all about passion, being passionate about your sports teams or your athletes or your sport. It's about a sense of community and camaraderie. So, people who share an affinity for a certain team automatically have that kind of personal connection. There's the emergence of various kinds of media and live sports entertainment to help fans get connected. So things like fantasy leagues and sports betting are a way for consumers to actually become or feel more involved in the actual sporting event that's going on. Collectibles are increasing in value. Um, as well. Sports products, there's new innovations all the time. Equipment is getting better and better, which is making athletes perform better and better. There's equipment tailored to different types of sports based on age and gender and skills, which is a new innovation. Consumer trends again are steering towards healthy lifestyle and things like wearable technology, nutritional alternatives. So people are becoming more conscious and investing in those things as part of their own investment in wellness. Sports participation, again, more emphasis on health and wellness, more motivation in terms of community or being part of a community. And they talk about Peloton here, but there's all kinds of community supports. Things like, PEI just launched in the last bit, a trail system and are encouraging people to explore the province using the trail system. And that's really creating a sense of community around sort of hiking and getting out and enjoying nature in PEI. Getting outdoors has been prioritized given that many of us were stuck inside during quarantines and lockdowns. And people are just emphasizing more of a work-life balance, especially during the pandemic, and that we're going to see that continue post-pandemic. Things like working from home or alternative work schedules and arrangements, more flexibility are all providing more opportunity for people to have some spare time to invest in leisure activities, and many of those leisure activities are tied to sports. So just as we wind down this lecture, just some things to think about. The most valuable sports teams in 2020. These figures, again, I didn't put these together, are all in euros, so not American dollars. But the Dallas Cowboys are the most valuable sports team in the world at 4.75 billion euros. You've got the Yankees and the Knicks, Lakers, there's some soccer teams, another football team, some more soccer teams. So those are the values. And then on the other side, you have the highest paid athletes of the decade. So it would be the 2010 to 2020. And we've got some boxers and soccer players. LeBron James is up there, tennis player, golfer, a couple golfers. So this just gives you a sense of how much money we're talking about. Floyd Mayweather made in that decade $915 million, so almost $1 billion in boxing. And that's it for this lecture. These are just some websites that students from last year used to put this information together. I hope now at this point you have a better understanding of the scope of what we're going to be talking about and including when we talk about the sports industry. And it's more than just marketing a professional sports team. It really is such a broad industry. It includes so many facets, and the ones that are really growing are maybe not what you would think of. I mean, certainly professional sports is important, but where the growth is happening is in health and wellness. It's in subscription services. It's in sports media. It's in betting. It is in e-gaming. Those are the areas that really represent, at this point in time, the most exponential growth. That and sort of some of the outdoor recreational stuff. So hopefully you have a better sense of exactly what is included in the sports industry, and we'll pick up this topic again next week. Thanks.